And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, as most of you know, I filmed 2 or 3 videos ahead. In filming the very first video, after I finished it, had a really good long coughing and hacking spell. uh, but hopefully, it cleared out some of the stuff, in my throat, and hopefully I won't have as much trouble in this one. But anyway, thank you for joining me here this Tuesday on Morning Musings. We're continuing our summary of what we have seen in our study of the Olivet Discourse. We're looking at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30, in which Jesus said, and again last week, 3 days last week, I talked about that they would see the sign of the Son of Man who is in heaven. So please go back and look at those 3 very, very important videos. But then after saying that, Jesus said, they, well, who's the they? It's the same they who would see the abomination of desolation, the same they who would flee from the great tribulation, flee from the city of Jerusalem, pray that your flight be not on the Sabbath, pray that your flight be not in winter, etc., etc. Jesus is still speaking of that immediate social context. Okay? He's not talking about events thousands of years away. But they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. I mentioned to you yesterday that I was raised in an environment in which the Old Testament was basically ignored. Listen, I had an elder for a congregation that I preached at. I was preaching through the book of Judges, examining the lives, the great courage, the great faith of some of those great men of God, and even the women of God in the book of Judges. After a sermon one night, this elder, he was in his late 70s at the time, he came up to me privately and he said, I want to know how much longer you're going to do this. And I was like, do what? And I asked him, I said, what do you mean do? What is this? I said, what do you mean? How much longer am I going to do this? What is this? And he said, preaching from the Old Testament. I said, well, brother, there are 14 judges. Some of them we don't have any information about. But I said, I'm going to preach until I've covered their lives. I said, why? He said, you need to stop that. You need to stop that right now. And I said, why? He said, because those are in the Old Testament and we are not under the Old Testament and we don't need to study the Old Testament. I was literally stunned. And I said to him, I said, well, brother, I said, Paul in Romans chapter 15, verse 4 said, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. And I said, you do know that he's talking about the Old Testament, and you do know that he was writing as a Christian. He was one of those fellows that when he got angry, he flushed red. I mean, volcano red. Whoosh! Simply walked off, thankfully. I didn't know what else to say. Absolutely incredible. Now, whether we go to that extreme or not, okay, the point of fact is far too many people completely ignore the incredible significance of understanding the Old Testament, as I shared with you yesterday. Even Paul told Timothy, from a youth you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. Well, what scriptures was he talking about, ladies and gentlemen? He most assuredly wasn't talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He wasn't talking about Revelation. He wasn't talking about 1 Corinthians. He's talking about the Old Covenant Scriptures. And so this unfortunate, tragic even, attitude that says we don't really need to understand the Old Testament in order to understand the New, it's a totally unbiblical view. Well, this attitude and this problem, I should say, is nowhere better illustrated in the fact that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, Jesus said they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about. Point number one, Jesus said they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, okay. What so many people fail to understand, and by the way, the great majority of scholars today recognize this. This is absolutely, it's basically never questioned. When Jesus references the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, he's drawing directly on Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, in which Daniel said, I saw in the night vision one like unto the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, and he came before the Ancient of Days. Well, first of all, we're told that that refers to the ascension of Christ. I used to teach that, but it's wrong. I'm not going into that this morning. Daniel 7, 13, 14 is a vision of the judgment coming of Christ in judgment of the little horn of Daniel 7, 9 through 11. So anyway, here's the critical point. Jesus is drawing directly on and from Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven in judgment. Well, you see, what so many commentators fail to see, what is so absolutely critical to understand, is that Daniel's vision was set in the days of the Fourth Empire. Daniel chapter 7 begins, 4 kingdoms shall arise. That fourth kingdom was the days of Rome. It's the Roman Empire. And it was in the days of that fourth empire that the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven would take place. Now look, folks, unless you could prove that there is another Old Testament passage that talks about the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, foretelling something different from that of Daniel chapter 7, then that means that the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, since it is a direct allusion to Daniel chapter 7, that means the coming of the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7, since it's the days of the Fourth Empire, and since Jesus is drawing directly on it in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, that means the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven in power and great glory in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30 was to happen in the days of Rome. Just like Jesus said, verily I say unto you, this generation, his generation, not this kind of people, which is a nonsensical definition of this generation shall by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled. Now that means the coming of the Son of Man of Matthew 10:23, of Matthew 16:27, of Matthew 26:64. This means all predictions of the coming of the Son of Man were to be fulfilled in the days of the Roman Empire, and more specifically, to refine this down even more, in Jesus's generation. And my question is, how do we overlook things like this? Well, we overlook them not because we're dishonest or evil or any of those things. No, we overlook these kind of things because we divorce ourselves from the Old Testament source of Jesus's prediction. So let me reiterate, this is so critically important. Unless you can prove that other coming of the Son of Man prophecies are not taken from Daniel chapter 7, or unless you can prove that they are new predictions of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds with his angels, So unless you can divorce some other passage that predicted the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, unless you can divorce that text from Daniel 7, then that means all of the New Testament prophecies of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds were to occur in the days of the Roman Empire. Look at Revelation chapter 14. John said he saw one like the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven, coming out of heaven. For what? For the time of the harvest and for the time of the judgment of Babylon. Oh, who's Babylon? It's the city where Jesus was slain. It's the city where Jesus was crucified. In the days of the Roman Empire. In the first century generation. Do you see how conflating and, and assimilating a knowledge of the Old Testament with the New Testament language of the coming of the Son of Man is so critically important? Again, ladies and gentlemen, this language of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven is not some vague, generic, kind of language, like, for instance, Steve Gregg wants to make it. No, it's very specific. There's only one Old Testament prediction of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. That's Daniel chapter 7. And to reiterate, Daniel 7, 13, 14 is not a prediction of the ascension of Christ. In Acts 1, it was a prediction of his coming in judgment of the little horn who was persecuting the saints. That's how Jesus uses that language of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds in every single passage in which he cites it. Shouldn't we learn from that? Okay. We're out of time for today. Don't forget the October 2-book special, Circumcision in the New Covenant, ? Marrying and Giving in Marriage in the New Covenant, or in the age to come, ? Save yourself $10 by going to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Look at the banner up at the very top. Order the book. Save yourself $10. Okay? You're going to love these books. All right? Thanks for joining me. More on the coming on the clouds of heaven on the flip side.